Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and this is our final episode devoted to the International Court of Justice hearings on genocide in the Gaza Strip. Tonight, we'll review what happened and what lies ahead. To do this, I'm delighted to be joined once again by the world-renowned forensic scholar and best-selling author Norman Finkelstein. He counts among his many publications the highly acclaimed Gaza, an Inquest into Its Martyrdom. Norman Finkelstein, it's a real pleasure to have you back with us again on Connections. And I want to just start by thanking you for the time you've devoted this week to helping us understand the proceedings in The Hague. And more generally, I just wanted to say that you're not only a scholar, but also a gentleman. You're an inspiration. You're a bottomless fount of knowledge, and your dedication not only to truth and knowledge, but also to educating, I think is an example that very many others would benefit from.
Well, I thank you for those words. Normally at this point, I would try to make light of it with a joke, but I'll forego that and just express humbly my gratitude for those remarks.
Thank you, Norman. Let's start with an overview of the case. South Africa went to the International Court of Justice, accusing Israel of genocide pursuant to what South Africa stated as its obligation under the 1948 Genocide Convention to prevent and punish the crime of genocide committed by any other party to that convention, the other party in this case being Israel. South Africa asserted that there was a dispute between these two states regarding the convention. South Africa presented a case before an argument rather this week before the International Court of Justice, asserting that genocide is being committed both as a matter of fact and as a matter of law. And on that basis, requested that the court impose what are called provisional measures. And for those provisional measures to be adopted, South Africa only needs to demonstrate that there is a dispute and that the ICJ therefore has jurisdiction, and that the possibility of genocide is plausible. It does not yet at this stage of the proceedings have to demonstrate that genocide is a fact. The next day, yesterday, Israel responded. It also presented its case in terms of both fact and law, dismissing the South African allegations. And as you've mentioned previously, South Africa relied primarily on the facts. Israel sought to base its case primarily on the law. And now I think we need to wait probably 1 to 3 weeks for the International Court of Justice to take its decision about whether this case will proceed, whether they will impose provisional measures, and if so, which ones.
There are many things to say there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to try to make just a few scattered remarks, and then you can focus where you would like.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I do think it was an exceptional step taken by South Africa. It's a non-white country, and it was defying the United States, which it just doesn't happen. And it was defying it and taking all the risks that they would incur by this act of this initiative of theirs.
An act of defiance.
This act of defiance, but bear in mind that if Israel is guilty of genocide, then the United States is guilty of enabling genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And that is therefore a damning challenge and indictment of the United States. What caused South Africa to take what has to be qualified as such a courageous step is a perplexity to me. I can imagine there was some of the things you said there is a not so hidden resentment at Israel for the role it played during the apartheid era.
In helping to prop up the white minority regime.
Yes, including the secular saints of Israel, like Yitzhak Rabin and Perez. This is not the Netanyahu era. See, young people don't know these things. Your younger listeners don't know. This was the era of where the labor governments were in power in Israel. They called themselves socialist. They were part of the founding generation, the generation of the kibbutzim and the moshavim, I think it's called, the plural. And they were the partners of South Africa.
Because Israel, between 1948 and 1977, was, for all intents and purposes, a one-party state.
Yes, and that one-party state was supposedly at the left end of the spectrum, at least in its formal ideology, but in practice, it was a main support of South Africa, and I doubt the South Africans have forgotten it. So there's that element of seething, if subterranean, resentment that came out. I would suppose that there was some lobbying done by people like by John Dugard. There was an element of lobbying. I know that he supported Cyril Ramaphosa when Ramaphosa was running for office. He did not. John Dugard wanted to get past the regime of Jacob Zuma. And I think there was probably quiet lobbying by people like Dugard to pursue this case. But there had to be, I think, other elements.
I'd like to add too, I suspect that there may have been senior figures in the African National Congress, probably also in its former military wing, MK, who perhaps also felt that there was a debt they had with the Palestinians for the support they received during the anti-apartheid struggle at a time when, as you said, the government in Israel was doing its best to prop up the white minority regime. And we need to remember that particularly in the 70s, these were both pariah regimes. The UN General Assembly passed its landmark resolution defining Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination, and South Africa was expelled from the General Assembly. I think that may have played an element. I think another one, we have to look at the broader geopolitical changes we're seeing, where, this is perhaps not only about Israel and the Palestinians, but it's also about challenging the US-led, US-European-led, some would say, rules-based international order, where the rules only apply to others, while those that make the rules are free to disdain them at will. And this is an attempt by South Africa, I think, informally representing a much larger group of states and people, saying, no, if you say these are the rules, then you have to play by them too.
I agree. I don't know whether cumulatively those factors can account for such an initiative by South Africa, or there are other factors of which I am unaware and will eventually, no doubt, learn. The second comment I would make is that it could end up being not so much a Pyrrhic victory, but not quite the victory that people will have wanted. And that was a misunderstanding on my part. When I was reading up on when I was preparing for these discussions and also following the case, I focused on the case rather than on the provisional measures. So I was looking to see how strong the case was for a plausible argument that Israel is engaging in genocide. And it was only belatedly that I realized there's another side. which is you can say that Israel made a plausible case, excuse me,
That's South Africa.
South Africa made a plausible case, but then go on to call for very limited provisional measures. And that began to me, in my mind, that began to be the compromise they're going to figure out. They're going to try to put forth, namely, yes, South Africa made a plausible case, but Israel also made a plausible case.
And just to be clear, the judges can adopt all of the provisional measures requested by South Africa. It can reject all of them. It can pick and choose. My understanding is the court even has the right to adopt provisional measures that have not even been requested by South Africa.
I read one comment, I can't remember whose it was, that said the court might ban the use of 2,000-ton bombs in civilian neighborhoods. That could be its provisional measure. So there's a huge amount of latitude. And with that in mind, I think they'll probably try to satisfy everybody by saying, South Africa made a plausible case, but we must remember Israel made a plausible case. However, since South Africa did meet the standard of plausible case, we have to go with that. However, because Israel has shown good faith in trying to cooperate with humanitarian organizations, and Israel did make a plausible case that it was obeying the laws of war, we don't know which side is true, then all we're going to do is call on Israel to abide by the laws of war, which maybe it was already doing, and to continue to cooperate with humanitarian organizations.
Yes,
that's a face-saving way out.
And we'll get to what may come next later in the discussion, because the court conceivably could also say, regardless of the merits of the case, we don't have jurisdiction because South Africa did not persuade us that it is.
That may come later. I don't think that's going to come now. That when it's out, when it's already in the shadows and everybody's forgotten and moved on to another horror. But I don't think it's going to do that right now.
So let's.
I want to just say one last thing, and they're interrelated. They're one point, but they're there's two parts to it. For the ICJ to say South Africa is making a plausible case, it's in effect saying Israel is lying. You see, that's a very hard thing for the court to do, because it's going to be saying all Israel's claims about carrying on the war according to the laws of war, cooperating with humanitarian organizations, not engaging in genocide, that they're lying. And it's very hard for them to effectively, if not even explicitly, say that Israel is a lying state. Nobody does that.
It's not done.
It's not done. And that brings me to the second half of that point. I've been listening and reading many commentaries which seem to be directed at me, saying that, I'm a kind of what you might call a reductionist. States judges come from states, and therefore act in the interests of their states, because that's why they were appointed in the first place. That's why they were nominated in the first place. You nominate a safe choice. And secondly, and also because you don't want to get on the wrong side of your government or society. So what do I mean by that? So I've read a lot of ICJ cases. I teach international law, and I've read through a lot of the cases. I've read through the major ones, the Southwest Africa case, which went before the court 7 times, longest case in the post-war history. I've read through the nuclear weapons case. I've read through the Nicaragua versus the United States case.
Was 86, 88?
The Nicaragua one?
Yeah. This was about the mining of Nicaragua's harbor.
And also the claim that the United States was funding the Contras, the terrorist war against Nicaragua. I would have guessed that's 84, but it could have been 86. So don't hold me to it. So I've read a lot of these cases. Now, it is true, I have to think, I can't be defensive about the point of view I put forth. There are cases, I'll give you a example. The Nicaragua case, for those of you listeners who don't know, we're talking about ancient history for a lot of people here. There was a seemingly radical government in power in Nicaragua called the Sandinistas. That was the era during the Reagan administration of the wars in Central America. And the Reagan administration was financing the counter-revolution in everywhere from Honduras to Guatemala to El Salvador to Nicaragua. And Nicaragua was the only one of those four countries which had a quote-unquote radical regime in power, the Sandinistas, and the United States was militarily involved trying to overthrow that government. And Sandinistas took the United States to the World Court. I think you're right, it was 86. The bottom line, it's true. When I thought about it, I had to acknowledge the vote was just 13-2. The United States and the UK on one side, and the other judges, which means American allies in Europe, voted against the United States. Why the US didn't put more pressure on France and elsewhere to get in line, I don't know.
Maybe it thought it would win. Maybe it didn't care.
Well, they did. Okay, it is possible they didn't care, though the United States submitted a huge brief, and the American judge, who was either the president or vice president of the court at that time, Schwoi, I can't remember. It'll come to me. Of course, he voted with the U.S. I did have to say, yeah, it's true. In that case, it was 13-2. And also in the wall case, when the Palestinians took Israel to the court,
2004.
Yeah, over the building of the wall, the vote was 14-1, which means Rosalind Higgins, who was the British judge, she voted, and she was Jewish, by the way. She voted with the majority. So that one I can explain. I think I can explain because the law was so overwhelmingly against Israel. There was no gray area.
It was black and white.
Yeah, you're building a wall in other people's territory. You can't do that. And the settlements were illegal, so you can't build a wall to protect the settlements, So that was a tough one. But then on the other hand, you have the cases like the Southwest Africa case. It was clear it was the colonial powers versus the anti-colonial powers. You could see it just by the votes every year, because the composition of the court changed over time. And so because it was over from 1950 to 1971, those 7 cases lasted 21 years. And each time the composition changed and there was an anti-colonial power, then the majority would shift, and the majority would shift back, and the majority would shift. So there it was clear. The point I would make in this case, and I could be proven wrong, and I've been wrong about many things. I think I've been right on the Israel-Palestine conflict more than wrong, but in general, I have my share of errors, significant ones, by the way. There are two things operating on the case of the court right now. The first pressure that's operating is everybody's taking a stand on this. This is not a back burner issue. This is an issue where everybody is taking a stand, and it's going to be very hard for a judge to buck their government in a very entrenched position on this particular issue. So, and then there's the second factor. We have to be honest about these things. Everybody has in the back of their mind the Goldstone debacle or episode, we want to call it, which is to say, Richard Goldstone was a distinguished jurist. He was one of South Africa's most distinguished jurists. He was on the Constitutional Court. He had the double immunity of being Jewish and being formally a Zionist. He was in many Israeli institutions on their boards, like the Hebrew University, and then ORT, the vocational organization for Jews. And what happened? He found against Israel, and his career was completely destroyed. He's gone. Nobody mentions his name anymore. He was
He retracted and was never heard from again.
That's correct.
Mm.
And he tried very hard to restore his image. There was the case where he came out saying Israel is not an apartheid state. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times because he was trying to restore his image. Well,
and he burned his bridges with both sides of the debate.
That's correct.
Mm.
He burned his. So when 2014 came along, Operation Protective Edge, the human rights organizations were nowhere to be seen. Human Rights Watch had almost nothing to say, and Amnesty International bent over backwards to try to defend Israel because everyone was afraid of Goldstone. Now, those judges know the same thing. Like some people say, well, Finkelstein's wrong. The Australian judge is independent. Well, guess what? There's a very powerful Jewish lobby in Australia. When she goes back home, if she voted that Israel is a genocidal state, her career is over. Okay, you don't want to hear that? I'm telling you that. If she votes that Israel is committing genocide and she tries to step back into Australia, well, she'll be very smart if she moves to the moon because she will not survive that. And so I think all the judges know the kinds of pressures they're going to be brought to bear on them if they buck the Israeli position. The Israelis are very vindictive, they're ruthless, and they have the power. So
I think it was the Narodniks in late 19th century Russia, or was it Stalin who said, kill one, teach 100? Goldstone was the one.
I didn't know that. I've never heard that before.
No.
Yeah, kill one, teach 100. So I think the pressures, even though I'm going to acknowledge it now, I was in error when I started to think about the Nicaraguan case and I started to think about the wall case. Yes, I could see there is a latitude of independence, but here it's a high stakes case.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a very serious charge to say Israel is committing genocide. People here are too young. People who are listening are too young to remember. I mean, Israel occupied a sacrosanct place in the international community. It's still, even to this day, it still calls itself the most moral army in the world. Well, guess what? For a long time, everybody believed that.
Yeah. And you were an anti-Semite if you suggested otherwise.
Exactly. How could it not be the most moral army in the world? So with those kinds of pressures being exerted on it, I think the latitude for independence by the judges will be very limited, especially when they bear in mind that at some point they're not going to be ICJ justices anymore. They're going to be going back home.
Very valid points. But now let's turn back to the case. We discussed South Africa's presentation, its arguments, on a previous episode. If you were to try to summarize that in 2 or 3 sentences, maybe I'll take a crack at it first. From my perspective, it was overwhelmingly compelling and very ably presented as well. And my impression is the South Africans went out of their way to address issues of both fact and law. I know that in your view, they focused more on the facts than the law, but what I thought they did so well is to focus on what is arguably the most difficult challenge they faced, which is demonstrating intent in order to distinguish genocide from, let's say, war crimes or crimes against humanity. Because unless they can make the charge of genocide stick, they have no case.
The South Africans made a very effective case on its own terms, which is to say, there were 2 ways to proceed. One was what you might call a strategy of preemption. namely anticipate the Israeli arguments and try to preempt them.
Mhm.
A second strategy is to simply ignore the Israeli case, which would have been basically negative in approach, denying that argument, denying that argument, denying that argument of the Israelis. And the second approach was an affirmative approach, which is we're going to state our case. We're not going to try to rebut Israel's case. And they obviously chose the second approach. It wasn't a strategy of preemption, it was a strategy of affirmation.
We're making the accusation, here's our evidence.
Exactly,
Mm.
exactly. And I would say the technical legal arguments obviously have to be made, but they were the less outstanding or salient aspects of the case. I was just reading the account you sent me by Craig
Murray.
Murray.
And just to interrupt you, because that was an excerpt from a longer piece he wrote, and this is just getting back to your previous.
I read the longer piece.
He was at the court, and
Yeah.
he and in his view, the judges were very uncomfortable, and
Yeah.
he got the impression if there was one group of people who did not want to be in the
there, it was the judge.
it was the judges. Yeah.
He also concurred with my own opinion that by far the most effective statement was the one by the Irish woman. Blinny is how you pronounce her name?
I believe so.
Yes. And that was the most emotive, but emotive is fine because we're talking about, these crimes are called crimes which shock the conscience of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And the conscience is a complex construction, including your mind, your soul, your viscera. The conscience is a combination of all of those things. Remember what Rousseau wrote. He said, men would all be monsters if they didn't have the faculty of pity. He says, what humanizes humans is not intellect. Absolutely not. Because the intellect has the infinite capacity to justify anything and everything. He says it's that feeling of pity, that overwhelming sense of pity, and that's part of conscience. You can even say that's the critical component of conscience. And she went using facts and using figures and eschewing images. She went for the conscience, shocking the conscience of humanity, what Israel is doing. And it was, I think, the most effective presentation. Not that any of the others were not effective. So I think that strategy, you alerted it to me, I didn't realize it. You said that they decide to use their time to just make their case and not try to answer Israel. So on its own terms, this affirmation strategy was wonderfully executed. I cannot say there was a false note. I could disagree with a statement here or there, I've told you already, but a difference is a difference. Each of them commanded authority, dignity, and there was, you could see among them a convivial spirit among a very mixed group. As I said earlier, it was a beautiful anticipation of a better world.
And some of the leading Palestinian human rights advocates, two of whom had come from the Gaza Strip, were part of their delegation, as was, I believe, Jeremy Corbyn, the former UK Labour Party leader who was hounded.
Actually, according to...
Or he was there in support of them, I'm not sure.
It was I keep forgetting Murray.
Yes.
Murray had, something that really touched me. It really touched me because it told you something about Jeremy Corbyn. In order to get in, because there was only 24 seats allocated for the public, you had to get there very early. You had to get there no later than 6 a.m.
And it was a very cold night.
Yes, and Murray reconstructed how cold it was to the point that all of his appendages were frozen.
Yes.
And Jeremy Corbyn, for those of your listeners who don't know, the former head of the British Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn came up in a car, and obviously there was contention about who was going to get in.
Yeah.
He said, Murray wrote,
Corbyn was being Corbyn.
Yes, he wanted to make sure he wasn't jumping the queue ahead of anybody else. You know, it's a
Sounds so much like Keir Starmer.
Keir Starmer would have been what a contingent from the SS to push to the head of the queue
and get the verdict he wants.
So, yeah, so it was the strategy of the affirmation strategy rather than the preemption strategy.
Mhm.
I think it worked, but I have to keep saying on its terms, because when the Israeli delegation presented its
We'll get to that next, Norm. I just like to throw in my 2 cents. I fully accept everything you're saying. From my point of view, given the centrality of intent to making the case for genocide, I felt that the presentation on intent was just so thorough, so powerfully delivered, and particularly because it wasn't just limited to, the prime minister said this and the chief of staff said that, but the South Africans managed to draw a direct line between statements from the top and actions on the bottom.
Yeah,
So you could almost make the argument, these soldiers were following orders.
Yeah. I noticed that Kenneth Roth, in his commentary in The Guardian, he pointed to that chilling video of the soldiers as if they were at a bar mitzvah, because the bar mitzvah, everyone does the horror. As if they were at a bar mitzvah, except they're singing, they're dancing to the horror style, but they're singing, "We're going to destroy Amalek."
Yeah.
And that is a searing image. Certainly it stood out for me, which is another thing the South Africans did, which I think you were a little surprised at because you predicted otherwise. I said after the first day that South Africa specifically said, we're not going to show gory images.
Yes.
And I said, I think that was a very clever way of preempting Israel from showing its 47
minutes
horror show of what happened on October 7th. And it seems Israel was originally going to show that video because it asked the hearings to be extended from 2 hours to 3 hours. And its explicit reason was
we need to show a video.
And the South Africans checkmated them on that.
Yeah. And in doing so, the court gave the South Africans an extra hour to make their arguments because the Israelis had been granted 3 to show their movie.
So that was well done. Well done.
That's the South Africans. The next day, the Israelis had their moment in the sun, and they focused very much, I think, on 2 issues. Context, history began on October 7th. You can't judge anything we've done without reference to October 7th, because October 7th is a key to understanding everything that's being discussed here. And secondly, that if you apply any provisional measures, you are going to undermine illegitimately our ability to defend ourselves from ongoing attacks.
Yeah, I think there I would maybe put it in slightly different words, but it's the same thing. They relied on Hamas.
Yeah,
It was basically somebody counted, I think,
137 times.
yes, or I
And I'm
think
surprised it wasn't double that.
they invoked Hamas at every possible juncture. And there was a song in the United States called Blame It on the Bossa Nova.
Mhm.
Well, anything that you don't like, blame it on Hamas or Nova, whatever. You get the idea.
Mm.
So that was a critical part, that if you think we're violating the laws of war, if you think we've caused a huge amount of destruction, if you think we've targeted hospitals, if you think we've targeted mosques, schools, everything, it's all Hamas's fault.
And here I want to interrupt you with a question, because one thing that's distinctive about the crime of genocide is you can never justify it.
Right,
You,
but
you,
they
you
were
can't even justify it if you are yourself the victim of
right.
genocide.
Well, there are many things to say to that. First of all, I want to get my thoughts straight on it. First of all, they first denied that genocide was occurring,
Mhm.
and then they wanted to justify the amounts of death and destruction. So they said, so the argument was, it's not genocide. And if you think the death and destruction was from genocide, no, it wasn't because we had a genocidal aim. It was because of Hamas.
Mhm.
So that was their two-pronged strategy for getting out. Now, there's a logical impasse in that argument. The logical impasse is, if you say that the Hamas tunnels are these ramified tunnels all over Gaza, all over, under every school, under every mosque, under every hospital, there are these Hamas tunnels, then the logical conclusion is, if you claim the right to destroy the tunnels, and in fact, that's one of your main aims, then you do have the right to nuke Gaza. You're destroying Gaza piecemeal by 2,000 pound bombs. Whereas if what you're saying is true, and if you say, therefore we have the right to destroy all the tunnels, then you have the right to destroy all of Gaza. That's the logical conclusion I at least infer from what they're saying. And then the question is, do you really have the right to do that?
Well, I saw it somewhat differently. My question is, given that genocide is one of those crimes for which there can be no justification, and taking into account that Israel categorically denied that it is engaging in genocide, do you think their constant reference to context was persuasive in seeking to convince the judges or those watching that there were other convincing reasons for them doing what they're doing?
Well, that's where we get to the question of the strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Strategy of South Africa was affirmation and not preemption. It decided not to in any way appear to be defending Hamas. It could have said, well, based on the historical record, it's simply not true that Hamas engages in human shielding. There's, an example here, an example there, but in general, they've been exonerated of that charge.
And the South Africans even explicitly condemned
yes. So
Hamas attacks on civilian targets.
They decide not to take that tack of trying to refute those sorts of claims. But then, as I said, if you don't attempt to refute them, then you are giving credence to the Israeli claim, well, we attacked this hospital because there was a Hamas tunnel under it. We attacked this mosque, and you lend a credibility to that claim. The only way really to answer it is to say, but human rights organizations say that you weren't targeting tunnels. You weren't even targeting Hamas militants.
You were targeting a society.
Exactly. That's what there were repeated findings of the indiscriminate bombing. So you're not targeting Hamas. And my argument would have been that even raising Hamas is a red herring, because you've said your goal is to turn Gaza into an uninhabitable place. That's your goal. So by that reckoning, whatever Hamas did after October 7th, you would have pursued the same strategy of targeting the civilians and targeting the civilian infrastructure, because you said your goal was not to make Hamas unlivable for Hamas. You made it unlivable for all of Israeli society. And I think they
All of Palestinian society.
excuse me?
All of Palestinian
Oh,
society.
Palestinian society. I think they should have said that. I think they should have connected that dot. But in order to connect that dot, they would have had to, in some way, suggest that giving an argument in defense of Hamas, and they didn't want to do it.
And South Africa is already being denounced by Israel as a leader of Hamas and so on.
Hamas apologist.
Yeah.
So that argument held up because of two things. Number one, South Africa deciding not to use a strategy of preemption. And number two, Hamas carefully avoiding anything that might be construed as South Africa carefully avoiding anything that might be construed as defending Hamas.
So one advantage.
I want to just one last thing, and then you take over. One thing that really, it just got under my skin is this Malcolm Shaw, this British jurist. He's so smug, so haughty, with his British accent, and he's like a character out of a British movie, like Charles Laughton. If you ever watch Charles Laughton movies, he often plays the prosecutor and the judge. He's a great British
and
actor.
Hangman.
What?
And Hangman, executioner.
Well, he was hideously ugly, Lawton, and it pained him for his whole life. But he was an absolutely brilliant actor. I love to watch his films. In any event, so it was as if Shaw was in a British film. He wasn't actually. He was as if acting. He wasn't actually a lawyer, in my opinion, as he came off to me. And what filled me with loathing is, Mouin, now I'll give you my visceral reaction as against my legal response.
You're going to appeal to my conscience.
Yes, I will appeal to your conscience, because I keep asking myself the question, what are you so proud of? Let's say you achieve your goal and Israel is exonerated of the charge of genocide. This is a very peculiar case. So if Alan Dershowitz gets off Klaus von Bülow for murdering his wife, although he did, or he gets off O.J. Simpson for murdering Nicole Brown Simpson, even though he did, or he gets off Mike Tyson for committing rape, even though he did, those are still acts in the past. So the worst is they won't be punished for their crime.
But the dead remain dead.
Exactly. What did Malcolm Shaw do? He was enabling a genocide which is ongoing. He was enabling an ongoing genocide. So if he wins, it means maybe 20,000 more kids will be killed. And it really gives one pause. What kind of diabolical mind would want to take a case like that. He's no fool. He knows exactly what he's doing. It's
And
like,
he's doing it with pride.
exactly, he's so haughty, so proud. It's as if, people may not like the analogy, it's as if the Nazis were brought to trial not in 1947, but in 1943. And Shaw is defending them, giving them extra time to throw more Jews in the gas chambers, giving them extra time to kill more Jews. So the whole thing, it's such a nauseating sight, because I think it is one of those rare occasions where somebody is called to the defense in an ongoing crime. Now, obviously, it's occurred in other cases, Myanmar, in Russia with the Ukraine, but those are rare situations. They're rare overall for a lawyer. And he was conducting himself with, this haughty, snooty, smug self-confidence. Just nauseating. Mr. Shaw, if you're listening, you're so proud you're an enabler of genocide.
Norm, the clock is ticking. We did take questions for tonight's discussion, and we'll be getting to those in a minute. I just want to make one last point about the Israeli case, which is they had the advantage of having read South Africa's submission. Of course, they would have probably also needed the Pegasus spyware program to determine what the South Africans were actually going to say in court. But the Israelis did not present a written submission, or at least not in public. My understanding is they did provide a number of documents directly to the judges. But nevertheless, they didn't really focus on refuting the South Africans. I think it's fair to say that the Israelis also focused on making arguments of their own rather than engaging directly with the points made by South Africa. The first we've discussed, the other being that provisional measures will basically undermine our security and cost Israeli lives.
Well, there are two ways of looking at it. What they could have done is read the South African submission and decide what it's pointless to try to answer and what they will try to answer. So they may not have directly responded to the South Africans, but they could have strategized and said, you know what, this argument's not going to win. Let's just forget it. That argument might be a winner, given the evidence that South African has adduced, so let's go with that one. I'm sure they had their strategy sessions where they very carefully decided which arguments in the face of the South African submission they had a better chance of winning. Mm-hmm. And so you saw that with Malcolm Shaw when he knew exactly what quotes the South African submission would use to prove intent. He knew exactly what quotes they would use. So what did he do? They went through each quote one by one and looked for the weakest one. So it was very striking. Of course, they didn't quote Gallant, no food, water, fuel, electricity.
Human animals.
The human animals one. They didn't quote the Herzog statement that there's no civilians.
No innocence.
No innocence. They went through each statement, which is the one that they can undermine. And it
was the one with the disclaimer.
Well, it was the Amalek 2.
Amalek, with the disclaimer at the end. Yeah.
Yes. Mm. Yes, exactly. The one with the disclaimer at the end, which no doubt Netanyahu's lawyer told him to make sure you put that in. So they did still have that advantage. They may not have replied directly to South Africa, but what they did instead was look for the weakest arguments. If they had to do that on their feet, They hadn't seen the South African?
They wouldn't have been able to.
No, because they wouldn't remember the statements. There were so many.
Mm.
There were so many. So that way they were at a distinct advantage. There's no question in my mind about that.
Now, briefly, just as a technical matter, what's next? There is no deadline for. First of all, the court sessions have ended. There will no longer be any further presentations or submission of evidence or documents. That's all completed. The court will now issue its ruling at its own discretion. It could be tomorrow, it could be next month. People generally seem to think it will be within 1 to 3 weeks, in which they have to determine whether the court has jurisdiction over this case. And if they determine that there is indeed a dispute between South Africa and Israel under the Genocide Convention, then they will have jurisdiction. If they decide they don't have jurisdiction, that's it. There will be no further action by the court. If they decide they do have jurisdiction, then they have to determine whether South Africa's accusations are plausible. They don't have to be proven at this stage. They only have to be plausible. Again, if they don't find them plausible, the case is over. And if they do find them plausible, then they have to determine whether to impose any provisional measures, and if so, which provisional measures to impose. And we're not going to get into that further because we already discussed that earlier in this conversation. And then, assuming that the court decides, the ICJ decides it does have jurisdiction and this case is going forward, they will then set a date for, let's say, the proper trial, if you will, an assessment of the dispute between South Africa and Israel about whether Israel did or did not, is or is not committing genocide. And people generally expect that to last for another several years. I just want to address one point because we got a number of questions about this. People were asking, for example, what is Germany going to do? My understanding is that at this stage of a case before the ICJ, countries that come out in support of genocide, like Germany, or against it, as have some others, do nothing at this stage. They merely express their view. They will only make proper interventions in the case during the second stage, when the claim is actually assessed. Is there anything you'd like to add on the further process?
No, I would say there is something we can do. I mean, you and me and some others, which is if it really will take 3 weeks, then we can go through the Israeli submissions and point to the outright lies, or as you said, as the Israelis argued, put it in context. Mm-hmm. So there was the last gentleman who spoke on the Israeli side. He was in the Attorney General's office, was it?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Deputy Attorney General.
And he says that we have an efficient system for holding people accountable.
Yes, that's why half the Israeli military is in prison.
Yeah, well, and then go to how many people were held accountable after Operation Cast Lead? How many people were held accountable after the Mami Marmara? How many people were held accountable after Protective Edge? And we could do that. And I feel like we have a platform now. We have listeners like the people here right now. And I think we could reach some of those judges and say, here's the truth about the Israeli claims. Mm-hmm. The other thing I wanted to say, and this might sound demagogic, rhetorical, but I do want to say it because I want it to be acknowledged. There are two heroes of this horrible, horrible episode ongoing, a horror that's unfolding now in Gaza. Number one is the South Africans. Mm. No other country in the world had the courage, not even those who claim to be defending Palestinians like Turkey. Turkey's a formidable power, more formidable than South Africa.
I think Turkey focused on trade.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Yes, and Turkey didn't do it. Saudi Arabia wouldn't even denounce Israel.
Mhm.
If you look in the South African brief, they named the countries which have denounced Israeli policy, and they mentioned Jordan, they
Mhm.
mentioned Egypt.
Yeah.
It was very noticeable. Saudi Arabia was not among the countries that had denounced Israel.
Mhm.
Um, at least listed in the South African brief. And the other heroes, and I know this is going to get a lot of blowback, a pushback, and the other heroes are the Houthis.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that facetiously. The solidarity that they're displaying is morally.
Solidarity of the deed.
Uh, well, it's solidarity of the deed, but it's something else as well. It's not just solidarity of the deed, though it is.
Mhm.
Why are the Houthis doing it? You know why? Brace yourself, world, because what was done to Gaza was done to the Yemenis.
Until October 7th,
That
Yemen
seven
was the most cataclysmic humanitarian crisis in the
exactly, and
Middle East.
why? Because
Mhm.
of the blockade of Yemen, just like the blockade of Gaza, and the bombing, the Saudi bombing, which was financed and facilitated by the United States.
With targeting and advice being given by U.S. intelligence.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So of course there's a Islamic element to it, but there are a lot of Muslims in the world. It wasn't just the Islamic element. It's the fact that they face the same horror. As you said, I guess Yemen is what, 7 million people?
I'm not sure. I'm not going to venture a guess on
It's
it.
either 7 or 9 million. I can't remember. But it was always ranked higher than Gaza as the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world between the famine induced by the blockade and the bombing. And I think it was something like, because I've written about it, it was something like 97% of the casualties were Saudi, because of the bombing that was caused. So it was a human solidarity of the most wretched on the earth, a human solidarity of one wretched people showing solidarity with another wretched people. And they issued, somebody sent it to me, this manifesto saying, forget it, folks, you will never stop us. You will never stop us from showing solidarity with the people of Gaza. It was beautiful. It really was. There's a famous film in the 1930s called Freaks. And it was the people in the circus who were the freaks in the circus, people born with all sorts of body disfigurements. And the last great scene of the film, and the circus owners were exploiting them, treating them horribly. The last scene, the lightning and the dark, and then rising from the ground, you see the freaks, and they're coming towards the circus owners. And this was the wretched of the earth, the freaks, the Houthis, who everybody likes to mock, and the people of Gaza, the human refuse, the Untermenschen. And now they rise from the ground, and I deeply respect that.
The circus owner, maybe one of them is Ursula von der Leyen, who's been renamed Frau Genocide by one of the members of the European Parliament. Of course, an Irish woman, and I always refer to the Irish as the only civilized members of the civilized world. Um, so your assessment, I don't think we need to discuss this much because you were very clear about this when we spoke yesterday. Youth, and you repeated it again today. You think that the court will not be able, as much as it might want to, evade its responsibility because it's not only Israel that's on trial, it's the court and international law that's on trial. So they will move forward with this. They will kick the can down the road. Um, and they will try to do the minimum possible, but they won't be able to do nothing.
It will completely discredit the court, if they issue a decision, we have decided not to pursue this case of genocide because we don't think there's a dispute.
Yeah.
That just can't work.
Yeah.
Can't work.
And they could surprise us, Norman.
You mean they could do that?
No, well, yeah, that would also be a surprise. But, you mentioned these other cases, and I fully understand what you've said about the floodlights or the searchlights being on each individual judge in this case. But, they could, for whatever reason, professional pride.
I agree with that. I don't want to be dogmatic.
Mm.
Why would I want to be dogmatic? Of course, I want them to do something, and I love to be proven wrong on these matters.
But it never hurts to be realistic and cynical.
I was listening again today to the two presentations by the Indian member of the South African delegation, the woman.
Adela Hassim, I think.
Yes, and the Blinny presentation, and they were so moving, so powerful that it may shame them, but let's remember, it didn't shame Shaw. And we shouldn't forget that. And they all come from the same international law legal background. It didn't shame him. Sometimes I looked at him and it looked like he was lost in thought. And I was wondering whether he was wondering, what am I doing here?
I think you're giving him too much credit.
Yes, I agree. I agree. So I would love to listen, folks, it's better to be proven wrong if it's a boon for humanity than to be proven right if it's a disaster for humanity. So I'm happy to be proven wrong, and I will celebrate being wrong, in this matter.
So we'll turn now to some of the questions. One is, you mentioned discredited evidence and pictures provided by Israel. Could you specify exactly which evidence? I think we have a commitment from you to address this and separately. So we'll take a rain check on that question.
I would say that anybody who knows Israel's track record, and I'm not saying this in a malicious way, I've studied it. Fake pictures, that's stock in trade for Israel. Pictures where they say it occurred, this occurred on the 23rd of May, and it turned out to have occurred on the 22nd of February, 14 years ago. Israel does that. No. So how much credibility can you attach? Remember, a lot of the first woman's, I guess his name was Regwan, the second person to speak after Malcolm Shaw. A lot of it was showing pictures, and you can see the Hamas rocket, and you can see this and that. Yeah, just like we saw the Hamas rocket that hit Al-Ali
Hospital.
Yeah. Just like we saw that. So that's sort of evidence. If you know the Israeli record, that evidence is completely worthless. These claims, as my mother used to call them, the photo montages.
But speaking of which, because you've repeatedly praised the diversity of the South African delegation, it struck me that there wasn't even a token Arab on the Israeli delegation.
You can see a cause is lost when its entire contingent is of one ethnic group. It's not that they just didn't have an Arab. They can't get a non-Jew. You see, that tells you a lot. That unless you're Jewish, of course, you can be an evangelical Christian, but I don't think they wanted one of those on there. More death, the merrier. It brings closer Armageddon. So they didn't want that. But it's noticeable the lack of diversity among the Israelis, typically, because they can't get any support outside their clan or tribe.
So, second question, whether you consider Israel's argument that South Africa did not give Israel enough time to respond for South Africa to plausibly claim there is a dispute. I think we discussed this yesterday, and you said you're not in a position to judge because you haven't seen the documentation.
No, but there's another thing. I have no idea who was right or wrong there,
Mhm.
but we have to forget, we can't forget, we're in the middle of a genocide.
Mm.
How much time do they get?
Mm.
Do
Yeah.
we, another week? Guess what? Another week, maybe 500 more kids dead.
Mm.
There's a certain kind of urgency. You know, they said, Shaw said, we acknowledge receipt of the note verbal the next day. And then a week later, we talked about getting together to discuss it, but you already went ahead on the 29th and filed your submission. Yeah,
Couldn't you have waited a month?
yeah, I know law. I have a case right now. It takes time, and years pass, but we're talking about people dying in
Mhm.
very large numbers each day.
Yeah.
So if South Africa pressed ahead, then I certainly think the court should take into consideration, you
Yeah.
know, what was it at the height of the Nazi Holocaust? 10,000 Jews were being killed in Auschwitz each week.
Mhm.
A week counts when we're talking about a genocide. A week counts. So if they rushed a bit to submit their claim, I think it could be forgiven, and I would hope the court forgives it uh, in the context of an ongoing genocide.
Norm, we have about 15, 20 questions left. Do you have time or would you prefer to wrap up?
Let's see. It's 9:08. We'll go to 9:30.
Okay, we'll take a commercial break for 2 minutes. I'll be right back.
Mhm.
And we're back. Before we go on, I'd just like to announce that this Friday, this coming Thursday and this coming Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern, and that is 7 p.m. 1900 Central European Time, Jadaliyya will be broadcasting the War on Gaza Chronicles that will feature Bassam Haddad and myself. So I just wanted to announce that. Um, Next question. If the result is, as you've suggested, South Africa has made its case, but we're not going to take any significant measures at this stage, does that still carry legal obligations or implications for other signatories to the Genocide Convention?
No, because no determination will have been made. This
Mhm.
is a very preliminary hearing.
Mhm.
And obligations to others can only bear on a final determination by the court.
Meaning when the case as a whole is adjudicated
Right.
in several years. Yeah.
Roughly about 5 years after I'm dead.
Yeah. And the next question is Israel, or for that matter, any party, allowed to give incorrect facts or false evidence to the ICJ? And are there any consequences for them doing so? And I think here, if I may, that parties are generally careful to tread a line where they can plausibly claim they weren't knowingly
They made a mistake. They
trying.
picked the wrong picture.
Yeah,
Israel does that all the time when it shows, no, that picture is not from there. That picture is from somewhere else. Oops.
yeah. And related to that, do you think the judges are aware of Israel, that many of the claims and facts submitted by Israel in its rebuttal have been debunked? And how can a respected lawyer get away with fabricating facts? I think I know your question to the latter, your answer to the latter question.
I
But
think it's a tough question because, the world's a big place
Mhm.
and you're an international judge. And a lot of these disputes that they arbitrate are so arcane. I mean, if you see some of the disputes, there's disputes called like oil drillings in Bahrain case, the dullest possible type of cases. So can they really have a broad expertise on every area? I think the likelihood is on 99% of the cases that they arbitrate, they don't know more or probably as much as the generally literate audience.
and base themselves probably overwhelmingly on the documentation that's submitted to them.
Even if they read it, but also base themselves on what they read in the papers.
Mhm.
The case is now if the case is in the news,
Yeah.
most of their cases, by the way, are not in the news. Nicaragua was in the news, nuclear weapons case was in the news, but in general, it's very obscure topics like what's his name? Craig Murray. He wanted to prove the independence of the court. So he said they gave a great ruling in the Chagos case. This
Yeah.
Chagos, oh yeah. The reason they gave a great ruling in that is because nobody's ever heard of it.
Also
So
known as Diego Garcia, where the United Kingdom basically gifted these Indian Ocean islands to the United States to establish an Air Force base there and expelled its entire population to Madagascar.
right. I don't even know the details. I'm learning them from you, even though I think I read the Chagos case and I can't even remember the details. So, so most of the cases nobody's heard of, nobody cares about. That's why the courts have a certain amount of independence, because in cases where nobody cares, they have a lot more latitude.
Mm-hmm.
So my guess is, listen, truth be told, how many books have been written on Gaza?
Mm-hmm.
I can name 3.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah Roy's book on Gaza, Phil Yu's book on Gaza, and my book on Gaza.
The late Gerald Butt had one too. As a former BBC correspondent. And there have been a few others, but I get your point.
So the likelihood that they know anything, and they
Well,
probably,
I mean, to give an example, you've mentioned several times the bombing of an Ahli hospital. How many judges will not have doubts about what happened to the extent that they followed it in the press?
that's right. If they get it from the press, it's a disaster. And most of them have internalized Israel, the most moral army in the world, however much evidence is to the contrary.
Yeah.
So you can't rely on their competence.
Next question. If South Africa fails to secure provisional measures, and I think probably the question should be if South Africa fails to persuade the court that there is a dispute, is that it, or is there a possibility of appeal? There is no possibility of appeal on such rulings, correct?
I honestly don't believe it's important. I have been of the opinion that these kinds of victories are, they're, I don't care about the moral victory because the actors are so immoral, but they are political victories. These are victories for the court of public opinion. If South Africa wins, it's another arrow in our quiver in the battle for public opinion. Just like the ICJ opinion in 2004 was another arrow in our quiver. Unfortunately, the Palestinian Authority didn't do anything with it. But had they decided to do something with the victory, it could have meant something. So I don't expect any real world consequences of what Israel does in this sort of like material, literal sense of consequences. But in our battle for public opinion, Israel being a genocidal state will have
Well, and I think if you want to look at it that way, and I fully agree with you, I think this has been a historic week.
yeah,
Also because for Israel, the support of Western public opinion is a strategic asset in a way it never was, for example, for South Africa. But having said that, that's today. If 2 or 5 years from now, the court basically says not only was this not genocide, upon further examination, this case should have never been submitted to this court. Will that damage be undone? Will that victory rather be undone?
I know what people will say. You see, they will grasp at that to say everybody who charged genocide, you see, you were wrong, you've been discredited, and so, and I will bear a burden on that since I was one of the early people who insisted that if you bar food, food, water, electricity, and fuel, you're advocating genocide. I didn't think it was very complicated. So people like myself, they'll say, you see, the experts, what do you know about law? The real experts, they looked at the evidence and they said no, and it will be a setback. We have to acknowledge it will be a setback.
And some people will then say, look, there was a growing consensus that this is a genocide, not only among activists, but among scholars and scholars of genocide and specialists in international law. You should have known from the outset that this is, as we've discussed, a political court in important respects. So you put that consensus at risk by going to the ICJ and now coming with a formal ruling from the world's highest court that this is not genocide. And you've undone all the hard work we did on the activist and academic and scholarly and legal level to demonstrate that this is a genocide.
Look, any strategy has its risks. John Vilgaard's a very smart guy, extremely smart guy. He recognized, of course, that there was a risk that the court would rule that it's not genocide and thereby discredit all the claims, including by himself, and he's an eminent authority, that discredit them, discredit their reputations, and harm the cause. That's true. Every strategy has its risks, and then you have to weigh the risks and decide how to go forward. But I think the court has to also weigh the risks because it could set off a civil war inside the whole UN system because there were a lot of special rapporteurs. I think it was 57.
I'm not sure of the number, but
who said this is genocidal.
Yeah.
And it will discredit every senior official in the UN system was saying this is mass starvation. This is a recipe for the spread of communicable diseases. And it's also, by the way, it's a big risk for the course for another reason. As the Economist wrote, I guess yesterday, they said there is a genuine humanitarian catastrophe, and the Economist is very conservative, a genuine humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. And the court will be giving a green light to continuing that humanitarian catastrophe. And what happens if those predictions are true? More people are going to die from disease and starvation than have died from the bombs. The whole court will have to bear the burden of having given Israel a green light to continue its genocide. So there are a lot of people who have to weigh their decisions. Dugard had to weigh his decision, but they have to weigh their decision.
And the South African government.
South African could be completely discredited, So, but the court has to weigh causing a civil war of indignation and also being complicit in the genocide. That's a real problem for them, because The Economist, which, as I said, it said it's one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the 21st century.
And this brings us to the next question, and here I'm combining a few. People have asked, what are the implications of Germany's intervention to the proceedings? I responded to this question on Twitter today, saying, if I was in the dock for genocide, probably the last state I would want fighting in my corner is Germany, but
well, they just do it for domestic consumption.
But I think there are two issues here. Procedurally, as we discussed earlier, Germany and other states, either in support of the genocide or in support of the South African case, will have no role to play in these proceedings until it goes to the next stage, so after the provisional measures are endorsed. But there are a number of other questions that ask, what are the practical legal consequences? Not necessarily for those who were involved in this case, but for example, for states like the United States, which is complicit in Israel's actions. What are the implications for them if or when the ICJ adopts provisional measures, and even more importantly, if it subsequently determines that this is a genocide?
The United States just doesn't think in those terms. The International Court of Justice decided against it in the Nicaragua case. Did it have any consequence? Absolutely zero, nothing.
And Israel very much the same. Netanyahu spoke this evening, and he said, we're not going to be stopped by The Hague. But then there's also another question, which is asking whether the US can be accused before the ICJ on account.
Somebody mentioned, I haven't reread the Genocide Convention, but there is apparently, I could be wrong.
The US has an escape clause, I believe.
Does it?
Don't ask me for the details, but someone had mentioned today that when the US signed on to the convention, it had a particular reservation about its own potential liability. Or
I think it was something about those who support the genocide are also culpable in the
convention.
Yeah, but I have to check that. I think we should be realistic about these weapons. They can only be enforced by the powers that be, but we can use them in our cause whenever we speak publicly, whenever we go to a meeting, a general meeting. Then we can use the argument, as I did for many years. I used the 14-to-1 opinion on the wall to make the case why the settlements were illegal, to make the case why Israel had no title to any of the occupied Palestinian territories, including East Jerusalem. In my own political activity, it was a very valuable victory. But I don't see is unless the state of Palestine had to decide to use that decision in order to, for example, bring down the wall, then it would have been a very powerful weapon for the state of Palestine, that decision, but they decide not to. And therefore, for folks like myself, the most you can do is use it as a weapon in the court of public opinion.
And therefore, I think you're taking the view that this should be viewed as part of a political battle rather than seen on its more narrow technical legal terms.
Yeah, you're not going to win anything. You're not going to win. You're not going to get the United States to obey the rule of law. That's never going to happen.
And again, ICJ resolutions can only be enforced by the Security Council.
Yeah,
and in other words, in this
not gonna
case,
happen.
their enforcement is impossible.
But I
But
think either way they rule, it's going to do a lot of damage to one side or the other in advocating their cause, except if the ICJ does what I say. They say South Africa made a plausible case, but we shouldn't forget that Israel also made a very convincing case. And so, because South Africa made a compelling case, we have to acknowledge it, but that doesn't mean that we're saying that Israel did not make a compelling case. You understand how they could do it to water down the conclusion to the point that it's utterly meaningless. It's like today, the CNN ran an article on the hospitals that were attacked in Gaza. And for every statement that Israel attacked the hospital, they quote the Israelis as saying, but there were Palestinian militants in the hospital. And for every statement saying the Israelis attacked the hospitals, they said, but of course, there was a tunnel underneath the hospital. So,
Norm, I'm now going to get to the last question because you have only a few minutes left with us, and this relates very much to what you've just been saying. I will just say before doing so, you mentioned you were early in determining that this is a genocide, and I think you studied it much more carefully than I did. You also have a much better knowledge of international law than I do. I was hesitant at first, precisely because genocide is unlike ethnic cleansing. It's a legal term with a very strict definition. And my view was I'll leave that to the lawyers and genocide scholars. So I actually came somewhat late to the game. I also had my doubts about the utility of going above and beyond creating a consensus on Israel's actions to actually seeking to get a formal ruling from the International Court of Justice for the reasons that we've discussed. But we are where we are. I think one couldn't have asked more of South Africa than it delivered. And ultimately, as you said, this is about politics. And the last question here is, how can activists leverage the court's decision, whether it punishes Israel or not? And secondly, related to that, should activists become cynical and further abandon trust in institutions such as the ICJ? I'll answer the second one. Why aren't you cynical already? And I'll leave it to you to answer the first one about how activists should seek to utilize the court's decision one way or the other.
Every prominent institution is in some way or another connected to power. That includes Amnesty International, that includes Human Rights Watch, that includes the World Court, the International Court of Justice, every institution embedded in our society, just for sheer survival, is in some way or another connected to power. And so anyone who invests faith in that institution, in my opinion, is being naive about how power works. On the other hand, we have to bear in mind that inside these institutions, which we, progressive, liberal, whatever you want to call them, inside them, number one, there are a lot of very decent people who recognize there are very few outlets to do something good in the world. They want to do something good in the world. Of course, they want a paycheck, and especially if you're a lawyer, because places like Human Rights Watch, unless you've gone to Harvard or Yale, they don't consider your application. They don't. They're not interested. So you want to do something good in the world, but also you want a paycheck. You want a solid paycheck. So where do you go? You go to one of these liberal institutions, and you get paid well, and you're ostensibly doing something good. And then when that institution is wavering, you have a possibility of affecting that institution. Now, Mouin and I go back a long ways. There were many, many battles with Human Rights Watch. And sometimes you can shame those institutions to do the right thing.
And sometimes you can't.
And sometimes you can't. But you can put them on notice. We are watching you. We are watching you. There are some decisions that were made by positions taken by the Human Rights Watch, which were frankly shocking. It was the case of
Human shields.
Yeah, when Palestinians went to the roofs of their homes, which were designated for bombing by Israel,
to defy the Israeli Air Force.
Yeah, to defy the Israel.
And this was their own homes.
Yeah, they're on their own homes. And Human Rights Watch called that human shielding. Hamas is guilty of human shielding because it encouraged the people go to your homes to protect them. And that was called human shielding. It was completely insane. And then the Human Rights Watch wouldn't indict Israel when it dropped the densest number of cluster bombs in the history of humanity on South
Lebanon.
And it wouldn't
in 2006.
Yeah, it wouldn't call the war. But there are ways to influence them. And the truth of the matter is, it's not a squandered cause, because when they do the right thing, Human Rights Watch said Israel is guilty of the methodical and systematic torture of Palestinians. That was a very powerful weapon when they came out with that report. Came out in favor of the right of return? And when it came out in favor of the right of return. When Amnesty issued a report after Protected Edge, 22 days of death and destruction, a 300-page report. Very valuable. But it depends on your politics.
And there's the apartheid reports?
Oh, and the apartheid reports. I forgot them. So there were the torture reports. There were the apartheid reports. There were the reports after Operation Cast Lead. You see, it depends on what your politics is. Some people think politics is just about the act, or as you call it, the deed. Whereas for the historic left, a large part of politics is what they called propaganda, agitation and propaganda. Agitprop. And that meant trying to persuade, trying to convince, having a full knowledge of the record. Lenin, you take, for example, Lenin, they invested huge amounts of energy in documentation. Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, a little pamphlet. He consulted like 200 books to write that. They took seriously the task, first of all, the life of the mind, and secondly, the task of convincing and persuading. And I did that most of my adult life was about writing, always being as accessible as was humanly possible, trying to develop an ironclad argument to persuade, to convince. And in the last round, the current round, it's not over by a wide stretch of the imagination. In the last round, many people in their comments, in letters to me, in comments they post, they all are so gratified that I know the facts, that I'm able to answer. I know the facts. And that's a large part of politics. So getting these organizations on your side, and they are vulnerable to criticism, like you say, not always, and it's never nice because they don't like to be caught in the act of being cowards. So it's never nice. But if you
Norman,
get convinced, it
please.
pays.
Norman, you're certainly no coward. You're an inspiration in your courage and your determination to not only tell the truth, but to document the truth. And you've certainly made yourself very accessible to connections and our viewers these past 4 nights. I just wanted to take this opportunity to once again express my profound thanks to you for the time and the effort that you've devoted to this program this week on the historic occasion of South Africa's genocide case against Israel before the International Court of Justice. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank you too. And I've already expressed my profound gratitude, not just for you as a person, but the kind of solidarity and mutual commitment to making the world a better place. It's a special thing. There are very few material advantages to being a person on the left, but there is a moral advantage that can, in my mind, completely outweighs the material losses, because you get to meet the best human beings in humanity.
Well, and in meeting you, I certainly have.
And I was lucky. We were both introduced to each other by Noam Chomsky.
Correct.
And it's a special, as I say, it's the compensation, not only knowing that you're on the right side, not only that you're speaking the truth as you understand it, not only that you're fighting for justice, but that you get to meet the best that humanity has to offer. And I count you among them. I take it as a source of pride.
Well, it's certainly entirely reciprocated and then some. Norman, thank you again.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.